This drawing lesson is to show you how to draw a jar full of eyeballs. So it's a little bit of a spooky lesson. Our focus is to learn about form. We're going to be learning how to turn circles into spheres to show the 3D dimension. We'll have height, we'll have width, we'll have length to our objects. So doing a lot of shading and shadowing to make those circles look like spheres. So the first thing we need to learn how to do is how to draw a jar. So the first thing I'm going to have you do is take your paper. You are going to fold it in half so that it's long like a hot dog instead of tall like a hamburger. So it's going to be long instead of tall this way. Okay, so fold it in half. And then what we're going to do is draw half of the jar. And you can kind of see my sketch where I've outlined it a little bit of how I want that to look. But I'm going to start with a jar lid. So the top of my jar is going to have a lid on it. And then it's going to come down with a little bit of glass ripples underneath the top of the lid. And the jar will continue along the side. I want to take up the majority of the paper, so I'm coming clear down towards the bottom, like so. Okay. Now, jars can be different shapes and sizes, so yours might not look exactly like mine, and that's okay. So the next thing that we're going to do is keep that paper folded, and then we're actually going to use scissors, and we're going to cut out along that half of the jar. So once you get that all cut out, you're going to unfold it. And it's going to look more like a whole jar instead of a half a jar. So you can see where I've already started drawing on mine, so I kind of have an idea of how I want that to look when I create my jar picture. So the next thing that I'm going to do is take that jar pattern, I'm going to lay it onto my clean piece of paper, and I'm just going to trace around that pattern so I have a nice symmetrical jar. The jar is going to be the same on both sides, because we folded it and made that pattern for symmetry. Okay, remember, symmetry is a mirrored image on each side. So once you have that jar traced onto your paper, we're going to work on doing some shadowing and shading to give it more of the look of a jar. I'm going to be using drawing pencils. In my drawing pencil set, I have a variety of different leads. They're labeled at the bottom. I have HB, 2B, 4B, 6B, 7B, and 8B. Now, every pencil set is a little bit different, so yours may come with some different lead weights, and that's okay. This will just be used as a guide. I'm going to pull up my scratch paper here and just kind of show you how these leads are each different. Okay, so I have an 8B, which is really dark. 7B gets a little bit lighter. 6B, 4B is middle of the road. It's not super dark, but not super light. And then my two lighter valued pencils are the 2B and the HB. All right, so that's just a sample of how each of those write. So for my jar, I'm going to start out with my 8B, which is my really dark one. And I'm just going to start out coming around the base of the jar, thickening up that edge a little bit and darkening it up. So I'm just taking that dark 8B lead, bringing that line down all the way on the side of my jar, and then I'm just going to kind of shade in just a little bit, not a lot, but just a little bit of darker areas that come in along the side. Okay. This is a blending stub. To clean your blending stub, you can just actually use sandpaper to rub on the tips of it if it's dirty. Mine have already been sanded, so I'm just going to take that blending stub along the edge of my jar, bringing that color a little more smooth and even, so it's not quite such a bold line. Okay. Along the edge of my jar, I'm going to use my 2B, which is a little bit lighter lead, and I'm just going to do a little lip around the side of the jar. This pencil line is going to come all the way down to the bottom. But once again, it's a little bit lighter. Then I'm going to do a few little reflection lines beside it. Some of them can be longer, some of them can be shorter. I think I'm going to do one more. Okay. Then I'm going to do a crazy line up here. This one's just going to kind of be, it almost looks like an M, but just where the light would glare on my jar. All right? And just a few of those here in the center, like so. Okay, and that's just going to be a little bit of a reflection line. Now, what I'm going to do with my 4B pencil, I'm going to do what we call some cross-hatching. Okay, so one of the art techniques is to make a series of lines. Some of them are long, some of them are short. They're close together, and then you're going to do the opposite, going the opposite way across them. That's why it's called cross-hatching. So this time my long and short lines go the opposite way. So we're going to do cross-hatching as a shading technique on our jar. And I'm going to start that up here towards the top of my glass. So I'm just going to make a few little rings that come across my jar to show the little ripples in that, how it kind of divides. Doesn't have to be absolutely connected all the way, but just to kind of show where that goes. And then underneath that, I'm going to do some curved lines that come down. Remember, we're going to be cross-hatching those, so I want my lines to, some be long, some be short. I'm just bringing those out from under the jar lid so it looks like it has just a little bit of shadow is my goal. And some of them are going to get a little bit shorter. Okay, I'm going to do some over here that come down even farther. These are going to be longer. And then this is where the cross-hatching is going to come in. So now I'm just going to go over them in the opposite direction. Some long lines, some short lines. And I'm going to continue that down the side of the jar. Okay. I need just a few more in here. Good. Okay, so now I want the reflection of the light to show around this squiggle line that I made. It kind of looks like the letter M. So I'm going to take my 4B and I'm just going to add a little bit of shadowing on the upper side of that with my 4B, and down along the right side, a little bit thicker on that side, I think. This once again is with my 4B, and I'm going to go a little bit lighter with my HB right along the top of that. So I've got my HB, I'm just adding a little bit of shadowing lines there, thinning that out. I think I'm going to go back with my 6B. Here it is, and darken up just a little bit on this side of that squiggle that looks like an M. Maybe even a little bit in the corners up here. Okay, now I want to blend. So I'm going to take my blending stub and I'm just going to come right along that reflection glare and bring some of those colors together so they look a little more smooth. And then that blending is going to go more towards the top of the jar. I can even blend over my hatching and cross-hatching lines a little bit too. Just gives it a little shadowed effect. Okay. Same thing's going to happen in these little swirls here too. I'm going to start out with my 6B, add a little bit of shadow in underneath them. And then I'm going to come back with my lighter pencil, which is my 2B or my HB, either one. Just go a little bit lighter underneath that. And then with my blending stub, I'm going to smooth out those colors, mix them together a little bit to make it look shadowed. Okay. The next part I want to work on is the lid of the jar. So I'm going to start out with my 8B pencil, my really dark one, and I'm going to start out by going around the rim of the jar lid. So that's going to be this oval that is up on the top. I'm just darkening that up with my 8B. And I do want to go all the way around with that. Then I'm going to do just some shadow lines. So these are going to just be squiggles, so kind of like this one right here. So I'm just taking my pencil, I'm just squiggling it back and forth around in a kind of a curved line. And I'm going to do that right along my jar lid. So let me show you my finished one so you kind of know what I'm aiming for. It's this part right here. That's going to be that little squiggle line that I was just showing you how to make. Okay, so it's just going to be some shadow on there. So I'm going to do that right along the edge. Just kind of a zigzag or a squiggle. And then as I get farther across, I'm just going to do a few little dots so it kind of looks like that line is fading and isn't quite as dark. Okay. Then with my blending stub, I can go right over the top of that and just kind of fade that color out just a little bit. Okay. I'm going to take my 4B and I'm going to do just some curved, almost circular motions here on the edge so it looks like that lid is a little bit more rounded instead of flat. Looks like it's a little more curved. And then once again, I'm going to take my blending stub and smooth those lines, give it kind of a softer blending feel there. Go right from the edge of that. Okay. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do with my 4B, the same thing over here on the other side. I'm just bringing those curved lines around so I have somewhere to shadow and shade. And then I'm going to come back in with my 2B to make it a little bit lighter towards the center. And then blending stub to smooth out those edges and make it look more subtle instead of a dark line there. I'm just bringing that shading into the center, once again kind of going in a circular motion. All right, so there's the top cap to my jar. Now what I'm going to do is work on the side of the jar. I want to add a little bit of texture that goes around the rim. Okay, so that's called hatching. And when you do hatching, what you do is with your drawing pencils, you just make a series of lines. They don't all have to be the same length, but you want them to be fairly close together. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with, that's Mr. Bays. You'll hear him on my video right now as he's yelling down the hallway to roll Tribe. Let's see, we're going to use that 6B. We are going to bring those lines down from the top of the jar, just along the edges. You can make shorter ones and longer ones. And you can leave a little space where there might be some highlight. And then we're going to just continue those lines all the way across the jar. All right, with that 6B, I'm just going to kind of darken up the edge of the jar here a little bit and add a little bit of shadow over there, just kind of filling that in. And then the same thing on this side, just darkening up the edge, adding a little more shadow. And then I'm going to use that 6B to bring that jar lid line all the way across. And once again, we're just going to add a little shadowing over on the side. And I'm going to take my blending stub and blend that towards the center of the jar. Same thing on this side. So it kind of comes over my hatching lines just a little bit. Okay. On my hatching lines, I'm just going to take and go from the top of the jar down. And those won't blend completely, but we want to just lightly blend those together so they're not so bold. Okay. All right, the next part of our jar is going to be to add a few lines for shadowing and shading right around the glass part of the jar at the top. So I'm going to go with my 4B. There it is. And I'm going to turn mine just a little bit. Sometimes I draw better sideways. I'm just going to do lots of really thin lines under there just to kind of show the texture of where that jar comes through. You can make some of them a little bit darker if you need to. So just kind of some texture going on there for part of that jar. Okay. So we've added some shadowing to this side. We need to do the same thing to the other side of the jar. So you're going to take a peek here. I've got just a little bit of cross-hatching going on for shadow right here on this side, and then I've darkened up the edges down the right side. The other thing I'm going to do with my, I think I'm going to use a 6B. Down here in the lower corner of the jar, let me move my paper up just a little bit. I'm going to make another one of those crazy squiggles like we did up here. So it's just going to be another glare or reflection on the jar. Okay, so that one kind of looks more like a W, I guess. With my 6B, I'm going to go ahead and do a line that curves around the edge of the jar, and it's going to go all the way towards the bottom of the jar. Just going to kind of show where the rim is, and then the 8B will be the one that I used for the outside edge. We want it to be nice and bold like we did over here. So I'm just going to bring in that 8B, bring that jar line down, nice and bold and thick. You'll notice that these drawing pencils write pretty smooth, and then I'm just going to bring in some shadow all the way up to the top of the jar, and of course next is blending stub to make that look a little more smooth. And you should be able to see some of the lights and the darks showing through there. The next thing I'm going to do with my 4B, I'm just going to add a few little lines along the side. They don't all have to be the same length. And maybe layer those just a bit, okay? Along my squiggle mark that I made here at the bottom, I'm going to use my 6B. I'm just going to fill in a little bit of shadow on that upper side. And then I'm going to lighten it up with my 2B. And then use my blending stub to smooth that out just a little bit. And that's just to show a reflection from the light shining on the jar, okay? At the bottom of my jar, I'm going to go over that with my 8B, so I'm just going to use my dark one. I'm going to curve right around, make sure I have the 8B, curve right around the base. Okay, and add a little bit of shadow lines coming up there, not too tall, but just real light. And then with my 6B, I'm going to bring that edge around the front of the jar and connect to the other side. And then you can also lightly do one that kind of peeks around to the back of the jar too. But we're going to be filling our jar in, so we're not necessarily going to be seeing a lot of what's happening on the inside level of that jar. So like on my original sample one that I made, that line came all the way back, but once again we're going to be filling our jar up, so we might not see a lot of that anyway. So I am going to take my blending stub and just kind of blend in at the base of my jar a little bit, and just like that we have the main layer of our jar ready. I was going to add just a little bit of cross hatching up here, I did forget that part. With my 6B, I'm just going to bring down some curved lines where that jar would bend out, some of them long, some of them short, and then I'm going to just cross hatch right over the top of those, and then use my blending stub to shadow those down just a tad. All right, okay. So our next step is to find something that is round, circular shape, where we can start tracing some circles into our jar. We're going to use those circles to learn how to transform a circle into a sphere shape to make eyeballs, okay? So the next step is just to find something circular. You're going to use your pencil and start at the bottom of the jar, and we just want to fill that jar up with as many eyeballs as we can fit. So like I said, I'm starting at the bottom. It is perfectly okay for those eyeballs to overlap. I would actually love to see some overlapping and underlapping with your picture. So as you can see, this one kind of sits on top of this one. I do need to do a little bit of erasing where the background of my jar was. So I'm going to use my eraser right here so that doesn't shine through. And then I'm just going to continue to stack eyeballs. Kind of looks like gumballs, but eyeballs in this case, right on top of each other here in the jar. So I'm going to do another whole one here, and then the next one I might make it look so that it's kind of underneath this one. So I'm going to do another one here at the base. I might leave a little bit of a gap. This one's going to tuck under, kind of in behind that one. Okay, so like I said, just start filling your jar with circles. All right, once you have your jar pretty full of circles, then we're ready to start learning how to do eyeballs. Now you can fill your jar all the way to the top, or you might have some that are kind of staggered throughout in there. So this is actually the sample of what I showed my kids in class, where the balls are just kind of stacked on top of each other, and then we're going to be drawing some eyeballs on those. So my next step, I've actually already started on mine. I'm going to pull this one over. I've got all of my circles traced in there. Now I want to transform them to look more like spheres. So I'm going to show you how to do a couple types of eyeballs. So on my first eyeball, I want to start with an 8B. And what I'm going to do is I am just going to go around the edges of that circle. Remember, if it tucks under or if it overlaps, you want to make sure you don't draw on those areas so you can see the overlap part. So like right here, this one overlaps on top of my eyeball, so I'm not going to color there. Using that 8B, I've just kind of outlined it, and then I'm going to make this eyeball be looking more down. So the eyeball is going to be over here on this side, so I'm kind of doing one similar to this, but I'm going to draw my black circle for my pupil with my 8B. I'm going to fill that in, all except for one little white spot that I'm going to leave empty, kind of like a reflection or a glare in the center of the pupil. Okay. Then I'm going to take my 6B and I'm going to draw a circle outside bigger around that. Okay, I want it to be bigger than the pupil. This part's going to be the iris of our eye, and so we're going to use that 6B and we're just going to make some hash marks. There's some hatching from the outside towards the center of the eye. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my HB, which is a little bit lighter of a pencil. I'm going to do some lighter lines in there with it. These might go, maybe these are going to go all the way to the center of the pupil. Okay. Then I'm going to take my 2B. I'm just going to lightly fill in with some color around that eyeball part, just to give it some shadowing and shading. With my blending stub, I can actually blend those colors towards the middle of the eyeball. Okay. So now I need to make the eyeball look round. I don't want it to look flat. So I'm going to take my 6B, and on the sides of the circle, I'm just going to start bringing curved lines towards the middle of the circle. So there's going to be thin, small lines that go towards the center of the circle. Okay, so I've just used my 6B to kind of go all the way around the top edge and a little bit around the bottom edge there. And then I'm going to come back with my HB, a little bit lighter, bringing those lines towards the center. And you can go right over the top of the lines that you've already drawn. It's just a matter of adding some shading to give it some form. And like I said, we're kind of turning that circle more into a sphere. Got my blending stub next, and I'm just going to go from the outside of that circle towards the inside of the circle, blending those lines together, making it a little more smooth. I want it to be lighter in the center and darker on the edges. And then I feel like my outline is just too bold, so on mine I'm going to go back with my 8B and just bring that dark edge up a little bit so it doesn't look like it's just a stark line right there. And then once again with my blending stub, just smooth those edges out just a bit. And then I've got myself an eyeball, okay? So that's how you can make a plain eyeball. Remember, your eyeballs can look in different directions. This one's looking head on, this one's more towards the side. I can make one looking up or to the left if I wanted to. But next I'm gonna show you how to make an eyeball where the whole entire eye socket has came out. So this is the gooey eye socket part. These are the veins that kind of go around the eyeball. And the other thing we can do on this eyeball, I didn't think to do that, but we could even make some crackly veins that come out on the eyeball here as well, just to add a little more spook and goo to it. So that one has a little bit of texture and depth to it as well. But let's go ahead and try to draw one of these next. So I want to find one of my circles where it's actually kind of laying on top of another eyeball. So I think on mine, or I could do one right here too, this one's more on the base. I think on mine, this one would probably be my best one because I have some space underneath it where I can do the socket part, okay? So what I'm gonna do, I just have my regular pencil for this, and on the underside of this eyeball here, I'm just going to draw some of that socket part dripping. Like I said, it just kind of looks like goo and yuckiness. And it's going to be tucked in underneath that eyeball, and then these veins are going to be coming up onto the eyeball, like it's just kind of holding on to it. So I'm just kind of making some long veins coming up. I'm going to do another one over here. Like I said, it's just kind of like it's holding on to the eyeball. And let me erase just a little bit right there. And coming around the sides. So it's just going to kind of come off the edge like that a little bit. And then I'm going to kind of tuck it back in underneath this eyeball here. So I've got a couple veins. I want to do another one coming up on this side. So it's almost like these veins are just kind of circling around the eye. And that one tucks in underneath. So then this bottom line of my circle, I just need to go back and erase that because that part's not going to show through because it has the socket underneath, okay? So the next thing I'm going to do is take my 6B and I'm going to add some little wrinkles just to give it bumps and texture where that eyeball socket comes down. I'm also going to use that 6B to do a little bit of shadowing in underneath those ripples or bumps. And then I'm going to come back with my HB and do a few lighter shadows underneath that. Just making those lighter ones come out. I have a little bit of an overlap here too, so I think I'm going to just kind of shadow in that area as well. And then with my 6B, I'm just going to do, not everywhere, but around those veins and wrinkles, I'm just going to come back and do a few places, not all the way around it, but a few places where those outlines are a little bit darker. So it kind of looks like the veins are holding onto the eyeball. Like I said, just darkening up those lines a little bit, adding some shadow. I'm going to do that all the way around, maybe a little shadow here on the side. I'm not going to fill it in everywhere, but like I said, I just kind of want to darken it up a little bit. Then I'm going to come in with my 4B, and I'm just going to kind of fill in those veins. Just going to darken it up. Same thing over here. You just want that eye socket part to look like it's a little bit different color than the rest of the eyeball. So it's going to be a little shadowed in. I'm going to leave it a little more white here in the center, shadowed down here on the edges, and then I'm going to come back with my blending stub and just smooth out those colors, blend them together. Like I said, it's supposed to look like those veins are holding onto the eye. And then the goo at the bottom of the eye is just kind of dripping into the jar. It's just nasty and gross. Kind of a spooky, gross project. My kids in class told me it was creepy. So I guess I'm going to be known as the creepy teacher now. Okay, so there's the base of my eye socket, or my eyeball that is in a socket. So the next thing I need to do is actually give it the eyeball part. So I'm going to go back to my 8B, that's my darkest one, and up here towards the top of the eye, I actually want to do just kind of a half circle or an oval where that pupil is supposed to be. And you can even leave a little bit of a white space for a light highlight, but that's going to be the center part of my eye peeking up towards the top. With my 6B, I'm going to come right around the outside of that, darkening up the edges just a bit, and then I'm going to do those lines that we talked about earlier that go in towards the center of the eye, or for the iris, okay? I'm going to come back with my 2B, add a few lighter lines in between there with it. This is going to give it a little bit of texture. And then with my HB, that's my very light one, I'm just going to color that area in. I'm just adding shading, giving it some color. And then with my blending stub, that's when those colors get to start mixing together, okay? I'm going to use my 6B and darken up the edges of this eyeball, and then we're going to make it look more like a sphere. I'm just darkening up the edges a little bit, and then bringing that 6B towards the center with some curved lines around the edges. And then same thing over here on this side, just a few of those little curved hatch marks around the edges there. And then I'll bring in some 2B just to lighten it up. And with my blending stub, I'll bring those lines from the outside of the sphere towards the middle of the sphere. Okay, so that makes it look a little more round. And then once again, if I want to, I can add some of these bloodshot marks where it looks like the veins are just kind of cracking out into the eyeball. And so I'll add a few of those in there as well. Okay, so I think the next thing I need to do is just darken up right here around the edge. I feel like I kind of lost my iris part there just a little bit, so I'm just going to add a little bit of darkness on that side just to thicken it up. Okay, so now I have a few eyeballs that are already colored on there. I'm going to kind of hold that up so you can see, and what I want to do is just continue that same process until all of my circles look like eyeballs. And once that happens, then your drawing is done. The last thing you're going to do is sign your name in the lower right corner, and it will be ready to submit for a grade. So have fun with this project. It's just going to be done in black and white with pencil. We're not going to be adding any color to it, but definitely want to look for that form, that dimension. Give it the three-dimensional shape where it looks like those eyeballs are realistic and round inside the jar. And that is our lesson on form. So don't forget to finish your eyeballs, and when they're all done, you can submit your work to me for a grade.